Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Pho, founder and editor of KevinMD. Today on the show, we have Ann McTiernan. She's an internal medicine physician and epidemiologist. She's also the author of the book, Cured, A Doctor's Journey from Panic to Peace. And there's an excerpt from that book on KevinMD, and that's titled, A Panic Attack Brought On by the Stress of Medical School. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll get into your book and article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I was an unusual physician because I didn't come from a physician family background. I grew up in working class Boston, daughter of a single mother, and I went into medicine on the later side. I had already been married and had two small children when I decided I wanted to go into medicine. And so the stresses that other medical students experience were really exaggerated manyfold for me because I had things to do besides just study. So that was one of my major challenges during medical school, and then during training as well, during residency. After residency, I was looking for a job where I could combine with family more easily. And so that's how I ended up in research. So I did some clinical medicine at the beginning as well as doing research, and then changed over to being purely a research physician.
Now, tell me what your life is like as a research physician, and also tell me how the pandemic has affected your research over the past year.
Well, research physician could be, they're very different types. I like to do clinical trials that uses my clinical skills as well as my epidemiology skills. And so doing clinical trials, because you're working with participants, sometimes healthy participants, sometimes people with a pre-existing disease, you really have to make sure that their safety is preeminent. And so it's not just doing experiments, it's working with people. And in order to do these clinical trials, we also have to get funding, which is not easy. And so we spend quite a bit of time writing grants and getting grants and then getting them, administering grants. I do very different types of trials. Some have been quite large. I was a project director for the Women's Health Initiative when that first started in '92, and did that for quite a while. And then I moved into doing more independent and smaller trials. Sometimes we're asking people to do something as what could be simple, like taking a pill. Sometimes we're asking them to make major lifestyle changes. So clinical trials can have very different types of interventions. And then we're also often following people long-term. The Women's Health Initiative followed people for decades. And in my studies, we tend to follow people for 1 or 2 years. So we really keep a close eye on how people are doing and what the intervention effect is. And then the other thing we do, we have to write scientific paper. We have to write up our results. We have a responsibility to those participants and patients and to the public who's funding these studies. So we write up these results. Usually it would have several trials going, maybe a trial or several observational studies where we're collecting data but not doing an intervention. Usually it's almost like having a portfolio. You have to have several things going at once to keep yourself going and keep your team funded.
And how has the past year during the pandemic, how has that affected your research?
It's been very challenging on some levels. Now, I'm lucky I can work from home, and I was required to work from home. But our clinical trials often require participants to come into our clinic, our facility. And we had to put that on hold several times because of safety for the participants, because our institution had closed some parts of it down. And so it really extended the amount of time it's been taking us. It's not been a safety issue for the patients that are going through clinical trials. It's definitely a safety issue. And those trials were allowed to continue, but they still had problems.
So let's transition now into your KevinMD article, and you talk a little bit about your medical journey through training. And your book is titled Cured, A Doctor's Journey from Panic to Peace. And the excerpt on KevinMD from that book is titled A Panic Attack Brought On by the Stress of Medical School. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read that excerpt, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to share it?
Yeah, so the excerpt is the prologue from the book. And what I wanted to do in the book was to describe with creative nonfiction, so it reads like a novel, describe what it was like for me as a young mother struggling to do medicine, to learn this enormous amount of material, to go through training, and then also at the same time to be mothering two children. I had a husband, but that doesn't take away the responsibility of the mom. So it was a great strain, and I ended up becoming quite anxious and ended up having panic attacks. I didn't know at first what they were, and finally, when I realized that I needed help, then I asked for help, and that was the book describes that process of asking for help and getting help. But the excerpt in KevinMD is the prologue, and it describes the first day in anatomy lab. And most people who have been through medical school remember that vividly. And that was the idea there, to bring in all the senses so that somebody's reading it can understand all the feelings and experiences I was having just on that first day.
If you could paint a picture for us about some of those competing challenges while you're in medical school with a young family, give us a story specifically of how those competing challenges affected you during that time.
Well, I think that would build up. For example, anybody that has a family or caregiving responsibilities understands the time that takes. And a typical day in the first couple of years of medical school, my children would be at school, so I'd take them to school, or my husband would drop them off, and then I'd pick them up after school. And after school, there would be things for them to do, maybe homework, getting supper ready, feeding them, getting them ready for bed, and that all takes time. And I wouldn't get to start studying until about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And for my peers, other medical students, there were no other mothers in the class of about 150 people. They could start studying at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and go till midnight if they needed to. And so that pressure that just kept building up and up, because I had other responsibilities. I couldn't just study. It just became overwhelming.
And you mentioned that you had symptoms then that you now know were panic attacks. What kind of symptoms specifically did you have back then?
The panic attacks that I had, I would just feel, I would feel like I couldn't breathe, and then I would get pins and needles sorts of feelings, and just about everywhere. And then, of course, I couldn't sleep. And I would have these, you'd usually be at night, so I wasn't having them when my children were up, luckily. And it just kept building up. They didn't go away. I kept thinking, well, they're going to go away, but they really didn't. And I talked to my family doctor at first, and then realized there was something else going on. And I remembered that when we went through our medical school orientation, there was a psychiatrist from the psychiatry department stood at the front of the room and put his phone number on the board. Back then, there were no electronics. So he had to write in chalk. And these were 3-foot high digits that he wrote. And like good medical students, we all wrote the number down. And I'm thinking to myself, I'd never use this, but I remembered having it. So I went looking for that number, and I called it. And through him, I got a referral to a psychiatrist. And so I started the process of psychotherapy. And for me, that worked. Back then, in the 80s, there weren't medications available for people with anxiety or panic attacks, or they didn't work very well, or they would have too many side effects. And so I chose not to go that way, although for many people that works quite well. I chose to go to therapy. And through that process, which I describe in the book, I actually bring the reader into the therapeutic room so they can see what happened. Then through that process, I was able to reduce my anxiety, reduce the panic attacks significantly.
Now that you have time to reflect on your medical training, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from this whole experience, and perhaps lessons that you could share with my audience who may be going through similar experiences?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot more concentration on and attention to mental health for people going through medical training and for physicians. It's shocking how for example, that the state licensing boards often will ask, have you ever had a problem with mental illness? Have you ever been treated for mental illness? And sometimes then people have problems with getting their license or getting their license renewed. The reason this is so shocking is that this is, while there may be some conditions that would make patient care difficult, it's also the truth that these things that medical students, trainees, and physicians go through are just being human. And so humans will react with grief often if they're under a great deal of stress. They'll get depression, they'll get anxiety. And these are the sorts of things that can be prevented or treated early on, and to encourage medical students, residents, physicians, that they can seek help and that they should seek help, and that whatever their conditions are, that they're treatable.
Now, how do you propose that they reach out? Because during medical school and residency, physicians are taught to be stoic, and there's a certain stigma that's attached to mental health issues. Although during my podcast and my blog, that's less now than it was back then. But nonetheless, what kind of advice could you give to medical students and residents in terms of how they can seek that help?
Well, first, I think it needs to come from the medical schools. They need to open this up so that they're talking openly about this, and make it acceptable to the medical school for the students and residents to seek help, to make it possible for them to get treatments if they need it, and then for the students to realize that it's not a sign of weakness to avoid getting help, it's a sign of strength. And that in order for them to be the best possible physicians, they're going to keep their whole body healthy. There's a lot of stress and distress that comes just from the process. For me, the worst part was the first couple of years when there was such an enormous amount of material. For some residents and medical students, the problems come with the severe sleep deprivation and stress of residency, and paying some more attention to those problems to try to prevent those, to help prevent the mental distress that can happen later, I think is really important for medical training programs.
We're talking to Ann McTiernan. She's an internal medicine physician and epidemiologist. She's the author of the book, Cured, A Doctor's Journey from Panic to Peace. And there's an excerpt on KevinMD titled, A Panic Attack Brought On by the Stress of Medical School. And tell me, what are some of the other main messages that you want my audience to take home from your book?
Well, from the book, I would like people to understand that physicians are human, that we have various aspects to our lives, and that it's a struggle. This is this struggle is going to be experienced especially by women with children, but also men with children that want to be involved with their families' lives. That balance is always going to be there, and sometimes it will be worse than others. One takeaway is that to realize you don't have to be perfect in everything. There's a concept of good enough, and most physicians just can't deal with that. But there are probably some aspects of every physician's life where they can just say, okay, I can be good enough in this, then I can focus more on something else. So I think that's important, then to realize there may be periods of your life when you need to pull back on something to focus more on something else. But we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to do it all exactly to such intensity as many of us try to do.
Now, after reflecting back, and now that you're a successful physician researcher, is that medical school journey, is that something that you would do all over again?
I think I would be better prepared next time, but I certainly have no regrets about doing it. medicine is a wonderful field, a wonderful profession, and I'm honored and privileged to have gone through that and to be a physician. So I would never change what I did. I might have tried to do it earlier before I had kids, but then that would have changed the trajectory of all of our lives. So I'm not sure I'd really would go that route.
And my final question, what is your take-home message that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience?
Well, I'm hoping that if people read this book, they'll come away with a sense of resilience and hope. And even though I write about some sad things in the book, that they'll understand and appreciate there's a happy ending. And I think during this pandemic, we all need a happy ending.
And how can people reach you?
I have a website, McTiernan.com. So it's ANNEMCTIERNAN.com.
And thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you so much.